The call came at 3:47 a.m. on a rainy October night in 1971. Dean Martin was jolted awake by the shrill ring of his bedside telephone, cutting through the silence of his Beverly Hills mansion like a blade. In the darkness, Dean's first instinct was to ignore it. Late-night calls in his world usually meant trouble: drunk business associates, manic agents, or reporters fishing for scandal. But something about the insistent ringing made him reach for the receiver. "Yeah?" Dean's voice was thick with sleep and cigarettes. "Mr. Martin?" The voice was professional, clinical. "This is Dr. Patricia Kellner at Cedars-Sinai Hospital. I'm calling about your daughter, Gina." Dean Martin sat up instantly, the fog of sleep evaporating like morning mist. Gina, his 24-year-old daughter, the quiet one, the sensitive one, the daughter who had inherited his dark eyes but none of his ability to hide pain behind a smile. "What happened?" Dean's voice was steady, but his knuckles were white as he gripped the phone. "Mr. Martin, your daughter is alive, but she's in critical condition. She attempted to take her own life tonight." The world stopped. Dean Martin, the man who had faced down mob bosses, who had walked away from Jerry Lewis at the height of their success, who had stared down studio executives without blinking, felt his chest tighten like a vice. His daughter, his little girl who used to fall asleep on his lap during Christmas specials, had tried to die. How? The word came out as barely a whisper. Pills. A combination of barbiturates and alcohol. Her roommate found her and called 911. "Mr. Martin, we need you here immediately." Dean was already reaching for his clothes. "I'm on my way." What Dean Martin did during the next 72 hours at Cedars-Sinai Hospital would become one of the most closely guarded secrets in Hollywood. No reporters were called. No publicists were involved. Even Frank Sinatra, Dean's closest friend, wouldn't learn what happened until years later. This is the story of 3 days that revealed the man behind the legend, and the promise that Dean Martin made to his daughter that he kept until the day he died. To understand why Gina Martin's suicide attempt shattered Dean so completely, you have to understand their relationship. In a family where Dean was often absent, touring, filming, or performing, Gina was the child who waited. While her siblings adapted to their father's fame and learned to navigate the Hollywood spotlight, Gina remained in the shadows, not out of choice, but out of an overwhelming sensitivity that made her father's world feel like an assault on her soul. Gina was different from her siblings. Dean's other children had inherited his resilience, his ability to compartmentalize, his talent for keeping emotions at arm's length. But Gina wore her heart on her sleeve. She felt everything: her parents' divorce, the pressure of the Martin name, the loneliness that came with being the daughter of a legend who belonged more to the world than to his family. Dean saw himself in Gina's sensitivity, and it terrified him. Behind his cool exterior, Dean Martin was a deeply emotional man who had learned early in life that showing vulnerability was dangerous. He had built walls to protect himself from the pain of poverty, rejection, and the crushing pressure of fame. But Gina couldn't build those walls. She was all exposed nerve endings and raw emotion, and Dean didn't know how to protect her from a world that would exploit that vulnerability. Their relationship had become strained in recent years. Gina struggled with depression and anxiety, conditions that weren't widely understood or treated in 1971. Dean, from a generation that believed in pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and not talking about feelings, didn't know how to help her. Their conversations had become awkward, filled with long silences and mutual frustration. Dean would try to cheer her up with jokes and distractions, but Gina needed something deeper. She needed to be truly seen and understood. The night of her suicide attempt, Gina had been at a party in Malibu. It was the kind of gathering that Dean's children were expected to attend. Beautiful people, expensive drugs, casual cruelty disguised as sophistication. Someone had made a comment about Dean's recent performance, suggesting that the old man was losing his touch, that his career was winding down. It was a throwaway remark. the kind of casual nastiness that was commonplace in Hollywood circles. But for Gina, who loved her father with a fierce protectiveness that few people understood, those words hit like physical blows. She left the party without saying goodbye, drove home to her apartment in West Hollywood, and made a decision that would haunt the Martin family forever. When Dean arrived at Cedars-Sinai that night, still wearing the clothes he had thrown on in the dark, he was met by Dr. Kellner, a no-nonsense emergency psychiatrist who had been treating Gina since her arrival. "How is she?" Dean asked, his usual confident demeanor replaced by the raw fear of a parent who might lose his child. "Stable but critical," Dr. Kellner replied. "We pumped her stomach and we're monitoring her vitals. The next 24 hours will tell us if there was any permanent damage to her organs." "Can I see her?" "Mr. Martin, I need to prepare you for what you're about to see. Your daughter is unconscious right now, but even when she wakes up, she's going to be in a very fragile state. This wasn't a cry for help. This was a genuine attempt to end her life. Do you understand what that means?" Dean nodded, though he wasn't sure he understood anything anymore. His daughter, his sensitive, loving daughter, had been in so much pain that death seemed preferable to life. How had he missed it? How had he failed her so completely? When Dean walked into Gina's room, he felt his knees nearly buckle. His daughter lay motionless in the hospital bed, her face pale and drawn, connected to monitors and IVs that beeped and hummed with mechanical persistence. She looked smaller than he remembered, fragile and breakable in a way that made his chest ache. Dean pulled up a chair next to her bed and sat down heavily. For the first time in years, maybe in decades, Dean Martin didn't know what to say. His whole life had been built on words, songs, jokes, performances, conversation. But sitting next to his unconscious daughter, all words felt inadequate. So he did something that shocked the nursing staff. Dean Martin, the man who had places to be and people to see, settled in for a vigil. He told his manager to cancel everything: shows, meetings, interviews. For the next 3 days, Dean Martin didn't leave that hospital room, except to use the bathroom. "I'm not going anywhere," he told Dr. Kellner when she suggested he go home and rest. "When she wakes up, I'm going to be here." What happened during those 72 hours became the stuff of hospital legend. The nurses had expected Dean Martin. They'd heard stories about demanding celebrities, about entourages and special treatment and prima donna behavior. Instead, they found a quiet, devastated father who sat beside his daughter's bed, holding her hand and talking to her in a voice so soft they had to strain to hear it. Dean talked to Gina constantly during those 3 days. He told her stories from his childhood in Steubenville, Ohio, stories he'd never shared with anyone. He talked about his own struggles with depression, about the nights when performing felt impossible, but he did it anyway because he didn't know what else to do. He talked about his regrets, about being absent during her childhood, about prioritizing his career over his family, about not knowing how to connect with a daughter who needed more than he knew how to give. "I know I wasn't there," Dean whispered on the second night, his voice hoarse from talking. "I know I let the world convince me that providing for you meant being away from you. I know I failed you, sweetheart. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." On the third day, Gina's eyes fluttered open. The first thing she saw was her father's face, unshaven and haggard, his usually perfect hair disheveled from running his hands through it. Dean's eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion and worry, but when he saw her looking at him, his face lit up with a smile that was pure relief and love. "Hey, baby girl," Dean said softly, squeezing her hand. "Welcome back." Gina tried to speak, but her throat was raw from the intubation. Dean reached for a cup of ice chips and gently fed them to her until she could whisper, "Dad, you're here." "I'm here," Dean confirmed, "and I'm not leaving until we figure this out together." What followed was the most honest conversation Dean Martin ever had with anyone. Over the next several hours, as Gina grew stronger, father and daughter talked about pain, about depression, about the crushing weight of expectations, and the suffocating nature of fame. Dean listened, really listened, as Gina explained what it was like to be his daughter, to love someone the world claimed belonged to them, to feel invisible in the shadow of his enormous presence. "I didn't want to die because of you, Dad," Gina told him, tears streaming down her face. "I wanted to die because I couldn't figure out how to live. Everything hurts all the time, and I don't know how to make it stop." Dean held his daughter's hand and made her a promise that would define the rest of their relationship. "We're going to figure this out. Not the doctors, not the therapists, not anyone else. You and me. We're going to learn how to live with this pain until we can find a way through it." Dean Martin kept that promise. After Gina was released from the hospital, Dean completely restructured his life. He turned down lucrative tours and movie offers. He limited his Las Vegas engagements to weekends so he could be home during the week. Most importantly, he entered therapy himself, not just to learn how to help Gina, but to understand his own emotional limitations and how they had contributed to his daughter's crisis. The transformation was remarkable. Dean and Gina began having weekly dinners together, just the two of them, where they talked about everything: her depression, his fears, their family, their dreams. Dean learned about antidepressants and therapy techniques. He read books about mental health, something that would have been unthinkable for a man of his generation just months earlier. "My dad saved my life," Gina would tell friends years later. "Not just that night in the hospital, but every day after. He chose me over everything else that mattered to him, and that choice gave me a reason to keep fighting." The media never learned the truth about those 3 days at Cedars-Sinai. Dean's publicist had crafted a story about Gina having food poisoning, and the hospital staff were bound by confidentiality agreements. But more than that, Dean had specifically requested that everyone involved keep the details private, not to protect his image, but to protect Gina's dignity. Dean's relationship with all of his children improved dramatically after Gina's crisis, but his bond with his daughter became something special. They developed their own language of understanding, built on honesty and mutual respect, rather than the performative cheerfulness that had characterized Dean's other relationships. When Dean's son Dino Jr. died in the plane crash in 1987, it was Gina who became his anchor. She understood his grief in a way that others couldn't, because she had been to that dark place herself. She knew what it was like to feel that life was unbearable, and she knew what it took to keep going anyway. "Dad taught me that loving someone means being willing to sit with their pain," Gina said at Dean's funeral in 1995. "He taught me that you don't have to fix someone to save them. Sometimes you just have to refuse to leave them alone in the darkness." The hospital room vigil that Dean Martin kept in 1971 revealed something that his performances never could. Beneath the cool exterior and the practiced charm was a man capable of extraordinary love and sacrifice. When his daughter needed him most, Dean Martin showed up completely. Not as the king of cool, but as a father who would rather fail at everything else than fail the child who needed him. In a world where Dean Martin was famous for not taking anything too seriously, he took his daughter's pain with the gravity it deserved. In a career built on keeping things light and easy, he chose the hard work of emotional honesty. And in a life where he was known for keeping everyone at arm's length, he pulled his daughter close and refused to let go. That's the Dean Martin story that never made the headlines, but it might be the most important one of all. It's the story of a man who discovered that the coolest thing you can do is care enough to stay, even when staying means facing the darkest parts of life and love. Gina Martin lived to be 65 years old, dying peacefully in 2019. She credited her father with teaching her that survival isn't about being strong enough to never fall down. It's about being brave enough to get back up, preferably with someone who loves you holding your hand. That's Dean Martin's untold legacy. He knew that real love isn't about being perfect or cool or untouchable. Real love is about showing up when someone you care about is drowning, pulling up a chair, and refusing to leave until the storm passes. In Hollywood, where image is everything, Dean Martin chose substance. In a business built on fake relationships, he chose authentic connection with his daughter. And in a moment when Gina needed him most, Dean Martin proved that beneath the tuxedo and the microphone and the legendary cool was simply a father who loved his daughter more than he loved anything else in the world. Sometimes the most important performance is the one nobody sees.